All right, we are studying in Ecclesiastes, and we are set to begin chapter 7, verse 1. I'll try to mention this again a little bit later, but as I always do, I'll have several Bible reading plans. And I need to print out some other ones. Some folks like it all, like an all-in-one thing. I do mine separately. I have a separate Old Testament Bible reading plan checklist, and then one for the New Testament one, which is Testament in a year. I think it's like 4, and that's almost doing like one chapter a day. It's not very much at all, so that's a pretty easy way to work through the New Testament. If you want to do twice in a year, I've got a New Testament in 6 months. If you want to get ambitious and go 3 or 4 times a year, I've got schedules for those, but I just kind of print those by request. Just not a whole lot of people take. All right, Ecclesiastes chapter verse 1. Get there. I don't always hear or know when this thing cuts out, so if it gets to doing it a lot, Junior or somebody just wave at me and say, hey, we're missing a lot of what you're saying, or if somebody's watching on the live stream and it gets to where you can't get figuring out what I'm saying, whatever, just let me know and I can always switch over to the Lord's table microphone. All right, so mentioned last week this in the New King James, this whole chapter through chapter 8, verse 1 is called The Value of Practical Wisdom. The ESV, as you see there, lists the whole chapter as the contrast of wisdom and folly. I like how this brother at the West Palm Beach Church breaks this down as chapter 7, verses 1 through 13. He calls it the school of life. And then the latter part of the chapter, almost latter half of the chapter, a little more than half, 14 through 29, he just calls balance. Now this first section, you look at in verse 1, he's going to talk about a good name is better. And he's also going to mention in verse 1 that death is better. Of course, we'll unpack that in just a moment. Chapter 7, verses 2 through 7, death is better than birth, which kind of goes with that latter part of verse 1. Verses 8 and 9, he's going to talk about patience is better. Verse 10, the present is better. And verses 11 through 13, wisdom is better. So, let's look at chapter 7, verse 1. And a lot of the Bremen folks I don't think I've ever sat down and counted how many funerals I've done in January 1st will be 13 and a half years, but it's a good number, and chapter 7, verse 1 is a verse that I use just about almost at every funeral because there's such wisdom in this verse. A good name is better than precious ointment in the day of death than the day of one's birth, at least in the funeral of a faithful Christian, obviously. But and especially verse 2, that's the one that I even if you have someone who dies and they're not in the Lord or not right with the Lord, there's truth in verse 2. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting, for that is the end of all men, and the living will lay it to his heart. And of course, he's going to go on to say, sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of the countenance the heart is made better. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, but the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It's better to hear the rebuke of the wise than for a man to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. This also is vanity. And then he says, surely oppression maketh the wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. All right, so let's stop there and talk about these 7 verses here. In this chapter, he's going to tell us about things in life that are better. And again, I like the idea here, as this one brother put it, that he's taking us through the school of life to teach us what's better, so we don't have to waste our lives as Solomon wasted so much of his. So, here is his 14th vain thing in verses 1 through 6, and that is association with those who don't think soberly about life. And so this school of life, if you want to call it that, opens up in verse 1, talking about reputation. It's better to have a good name than costly perfume, ointment. The King James, of course, has precious ointment, and that's what the New King James has as well. Well, it looks like the ESV does as well. I was thinking one of those had perfume there, but maybe I'm thinking of a different version. But that's the idea. It's better than costly ointment, costly perfume, whatever you want to fill in the blank with. That good name is better. It's better than the good stuff, things that we might accumulate or obtain in this life. He's already spent a lot of time in Ecclesiastes talking about the futility of our efforts in this life and how you might spend a great portion of your time accumulating wealth only to, well, it's the way of all the earth. You're going to die, you're going to leave it, and then what becomes of it? Your son may be a fool. He may not have a son. He may squander it. He may, even if he uses it wisely, you're not around at that point. So he's talking about the futility throughout much of the book of our efforts in this life. And the point here being that so often we give a great deal of time, a great deal of effort to things in life that really just don't matter that much or provide lasting benefits. And so that's kind of what he's warning us against. And here the teacher basically says, what does it matter if you work, and gain, but nobody even likes you? You know, you're known as, we've mentioned it several times, it just kind of happened that we got to this section around holiday season, but the Charles Dickens character, Ebenezer Scrooge, has come to mind a few times here in these recent sections of Ecclesiastes. But that's the idea. I mean, here's a guy that he works, and he accumulates all this wealth, and yet nobody likes the guy. And what good is that if you could be the wealthiest man in the world, but if nobody likes you? Because again, we've hit on this several times in these last few chapters. Life is all about relationships. And all the money in the world doesn't matter if you don't have people in your life to enjoy that with, and even just a little, and enjoy that with people, and those relationships is better than to have all that wealth and nobody even likes you. And so that's kind of the idea here. What's the point of success if nobody even wants to be around you at all? It's amazing sometimes you can read these stories of somebody who's worked with a famous actor or a famous singer, and talk about how demanding they were and sometimes just arrogant, and everything's about them. Well, what good is fame? What good is fortune? Nobody even wants to be around you. Some people just don't get that. And, you know, I've also heard stories that were the other way, that here's somebody that, you know, to be fair, there are those that people say, here's somebody very wealthy, very famous, but they just treated everybody like they were equals, and they were humble. Well, that's an appreciation for the things that we have. But the most important things in life are not things at all. It's relationships. And so he says, you can have all that success, but what good is it if nobody wants to be around you? Even if you amass huge wealth, so what? Everybody just rolls their eyes, or maybe they grumble at the very mention of your name. You know, again, probably we've all known situations like that. Maybe somebody that you know, they may be very wealthy, but somebody talks about, oh, you know, so-and-so, man, he's got millions. He's worth billions. And somebody may roll their eyes and say, yeah, that guy's a real jerk. And sometimes that's how it is, because people get to focusing on the wrong things in life. Another point here is that money won't fix a reputation. You can have all the money in the world, but you're not going to buy yourself a good name. You just can't do it. You can't buy yourself a good name. It takes time, it takes effort to build a good reputation. And one of those things I can remember my dad saying numerous times throughout the years, just sometimes in conversation, sometimes trying to drive it home to me as a child growing up, and my sister as well, is that, it takes years sometimes to build a reputation, to build trust, and yet you can destroy it in a moment. You can ruin a reputation in a single act, quite often, in a single moment, and likewise with trust. But you're not going to buy it. You can't buy a good reputation, can't buy trust. It's something that takes time, it takes effort. But here's a question for us to think about that we all ought to ask ourselves. What do people think of when they hear my name? And sometimes that's difficult to know, just because, you'd have to hear somebody talking about you and them not know you're there. Sometimes somebody knows you're there. They may say, oh, man, he's such a great guy. But what do people think about when they think about my name? Do they think about a person who is striving to live a godly life, to live according to God's wisdom? Do they think about somebody who's generous, a loving person, compassionate? Or is it something else? And that's what Solomon is getting at here. God, through Solomon, is getting at here. Our choices, our words, they're building a reputation day by day, week by week, month by month, year by year. Always. And so we need to take heed, because a good reputation is of tremendous value, more so than financial wealth, all the stuff of this life. And that's what he's getting at here. But he also says, of course, death is better than birth. I wrote in my notes, what? Because this world, and in fact kind of our human nature, sort of repulses at such a statement. Death is better than birth? This world scoffs at that very idea, that very notion. But if you look back just a little bit to chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, he says, so I returned and considered all the oppressions that are done under the sun. Behold, the tears of such as were oppressed, and they had no comforter. And on the side of their oppressors there was power, but they had no comforter. Wherefore I praise the dead which are already dead, more than the living which are yet alive. So kind of similar wording there. He says it's better never to live, as opposed to going through all the suffering, the injustice that exists here in this life, in this world. But he's circling back, it seems, to that, and kind of essentially saying that his thinking was off. And in many instances, our thinking is off. We think death is a bad thing. And there's an element of that I think is unavoidable, because God has put in us all the will to live. But we just tend to think of it inherently as a bad thing. Yes, sir?
Celebration. He said it is. He said we're going to meet God. He said when you're born, that's when we cry, because you got heartache, disappointments, and suffering that you're going to have to go through until you get to the happy part.
Yeah. And so in that sense, yeah, it's, sometimes funerals are sad and they're down. But if we die in the Lord, there's a sense, and again, we understand, for those of us who are here, we're going to miss anybody who's a part of our lives, and now they're gone. So it's not like it's wrong to be sad, but there's another sense in which, yeah, it ought to be a celebration. And sometimes I like how it seems like, especially in recent years, I've seen more and more people, especially with faithful Christians, where there's a funeral and they talk about it's a celebration of life. And that's, for the faithful child of God, that's what our funeral ought to be, a celebration of the life that we live, preparing for that moment that we left this life. Brother Chris will say a lot, I've heard him say numerous times over the years, when one of our members here passed away, hey, she lived her whole life for this day. He lived his whole life for this particular day, talking about not necessarily the day of the funeral, but the day that they left this life. And so in that sense, yeah, death is better than birth. Birth is the beginning of that life, and it's about, how do I spend that life? Am I going to make, when I reach that age of accountability, do I start preparing for the inevitable day of death, which is coming? And that's a big theme in Ecclesiastes. The rich, the poor, the well-known, the unknown, the powerful, the weak, they all die. Even down to the animal kingdom, we all die. How am I living my life up to that point? And so he's saying the thinking of, it's better never to live as opposed to going through all the injustices of this life. That thinking is off. But he does say death is not inherently a bad thing. We try to avoid death at all costs. And again, there's a sense of that which is normal, because we sometimes talk about maybe somebody's very sick, they've been struggling with health for a long time. We sometimes say, now don't just give up, and we'll battle to, if there's some kind of medical procedure we think we can do or whatever, we're going to try to do that to try to help that loved one in every way that we can. But understanding death, for people of faith, God's people, it's not a bad thing. It's a homecoming, a homegoing. God's people know life is not the highest goal. That comes at death. And that's what, again, to use that expression that Chris uses a lot, that's what we live our entire lives for up to that moment. Yes, sir, Brother Steve.
Doesn't seem to trouble you as much. This makes more sense. And just from things I've heard, my grandfather, literally probably 15 minutes before he massive stroke and gone, sat out there at the kitchen table. He used to call me old timer. He says, old timer, I think I've been here a long time. And he was ready. He was an elder of the church. He was ready. I can remember my grandmother, when a friend of theirs, same age group as my grandfather, she got the news from my mother that he passed away, and the first words out of her mouth was, "Lucky Lonnie."
Yeah.
And then I can remember my dad in his last declining years, same scenario. What kind of life is this? I'm ready to go. I can't do anything that I want to do anymore. But from a faithful Christian perspective, as you get older, you take a whole new look on things like this that trouble somebody that's not so old. As they get older, they actually are looking forward to it.
Yeah, and I think that is, sometimes there's that perspective as we get older, and it's, there is still the will to live and to survive, but yeah, you get, especially if you've prepared your soul for that moment. I was thinking about Sister, we always just called her Sister Etta. I think her name was like John Etta or something like that. But in Childersburg, she was, she was one of the members there, and she, by the time I had come to Childersburg, she was a widow, and her daughter was our secretary. And one day she passed while I was still there preaching in Childersburg. But one day, her daughter, who was our secretary, was talking to me, and she says, she was frustrated with her mom because her mom kept talking about, well, I'm just ready. I'm just ready to go. And she said, I'm not, don't don't get concerned, think I'm going to try to do something to hurt myself or harm myself. But I'm ready. I'm tired. I miss my husband. He was a faithful Christian. I want to go see him again. I'm ready to go home. And she would say, Mama, don't talk like that. And one day I got to thinking about it, and I told that sister, who was our secretary, I said, now, I wouldn't be too hard on her, because I think that's a pretty awesome perspective. Because I don't remember her exact wording, but essentially what she so often would say is, I'm going to work till the Lord calls me home, and I'm going to do what I can till he calls me home. But I hope he knows I'm sitting on ready. And that was kind of the way she lived her life. And like I said, I came there. We were there a little over 2 years before we came here to Bremen. And the whole time I was there, that was exactly how she lived her life. She didn't just sit at home pining away like, oh, just take me now, Lord. She would do anything she could for anybody to help out, to help the church, to help somebody who was in need. But she made no secret. She did not hide it. She did not disguise it. She was very open that I am ready. Whenever the Lord's ready for me, I am ready to go home. And sometimes her daughter would kind of get after her about that. And finally one day I said, leave her alone. I think that's a pretty good perspective. As long as she keeps that in the right perspective and she's doing what she can while she can, and she was, that's the biblical perspective. Because again, God's people know this life's not the highest goal. It's not about this life. And sometimes we try to hang on to it so much so that we act like that it is. But it's not. The highest goal comes at death. And of course, probably most of us, if not all of us, are familiar with Paul's statement, Philippians 1:21, that for me to live is Christ and to die is gain. And that's similar here to his statement. The day of death is better than the day of one's birth. Death is the point of life. It's not an evil outcome. It is the outcome for everybody, unless we live until the Lord returns. That is the outcome. It's the way of all the earth. We sometimes sing, this world is not my home. The old-time preachers used to have, I've heard, I don't know if I've ever heard it preached, but I've seen the outline several different times that different preachers put together. They called it singing a lie. And, sometimes they would use songs to illustrate how we sing a lie. And it's just as wrong to sing a lie as it is to tell a lie. But sometimes we'll say, I have decided to follow Jesus, but I'm not following Jesus. And that's, if I sing that and I'm not going to strive, it's not to say perfection, of course, but if I'm not striving to follow him, I'm just singing a lie. Trust and obey. There's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. But if I'm not trusting and obeying, well, I'm just singing a lie. We'll work till Jesus comes. Well, am I working? And so one of them that was in that outline, or a couple outlines that I've seen over the years, was, this world is not my home. I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. The angels beckon me from heaven's open door, and I can't feel at home in this world anymore. When we sing that, do we really mean it? That's a struggle sometimes, isn't it? I wish I could remember the song. It just left me. One day we were in chapel at preaching school, and we sang this song about, what is the song where it talks about and like the prophet, my pillow a stone. I'm satisfied with just a cottage below, a little silver and a little gold. But in that city where the ransom will shine, I've got a mansion of purest gold. And I think it was maybe at the end of the first verse, Brother Mosier, you just have to know Brother Mosier, sometimes he can just burst out with something, and he says, stop. Brethren, I don't think any of us can sing that song scripturally. I said, what? He said, I'm satisfied with just a cottage below. I don't think any of us is living just in a little cottage. And so he kind of ranted about that for a little bit. But that's one of those things that it just sort of stuck with me, and I remember that. But there is some truth to that, and we need to be careful when we're singing. I've seen another idea from preachers of old of praying a lie. One preacher talked about people a lot of times will end a service with "bring us back at the next appointed time." He says sometimes people will do that on Sunday morning, knowing good and well they're not coming back Sunday night. They're just going to choose to stay at home, or maybe they do that Sunday night, knowing good and well they're just going to choose to stay home and skip the Wednesday evening Bible study. And so be careful that you're not praying a lie. But this world is not home. And so in 2 Corinthians 5:4, Paul talks about that death is swallowed up, life is swallowed up in immortality. The mortality is swallowed up in immortality. So death for God's people means that mortality is swallowed up by life. It's the end of the futility of this life. Death is the end of this vain life, with its pain, its suffering, and so on. But it is the initiation of why God created me, why God created you. And especially in view of, it's the initiation of why God didn't it? Especially the initiation of why God recreated me, in the sense of 2 Corinthians 5:17. If any man be in Christ, he is a new creature. Become new. It's so weird. It's a crazy thing. Sometimes I think there's probably a short in this one as well. Maybe if I hold it, it'll do better. So, death, it's the end of this vain life, but it is the initiation of why God created me, and especially recreated me, formed me anew spiritually when I became a Christian. All right, so verses 2 through 6, kind of continuing this idea. Again, our worldly thinking bristles and scoffs at the idea here of verses 2 through 6. It's better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Like, seriously? Because everybody loves a party. And a funeral is one of those things that we don't typically, I mean, we might enjoy it from the standpoint of sometimes you're going to see people that you haven't seen in a long time. Sometimes I've been at funerals and maybe even just the family talking about, boy, it's great that we are able to get together. We haven't gotten together like this, so many of us all here under one roof like this in years. But typically people are not just super excited about going to that funeral. And yet Solomon says better to go to the house of mourning than to the house of feasting. Why would you say that, Solomon? Why would God inspire Solomon to say that? Well, he tells us that's the end of all men. And the living will lay it to his heart. Funerals, times of mourning, are times of reflection, contemplation. At least it should be. And so that's why he goes on. He says, sorrow is better than laughter, because by the sadness of the countenance, the heart is made better. Again, contemplation, thinking about our own mortality. The heart of the wise is in the house of mourning. The heart of fools is in the house of mirth, because the fool always wants a party. He doesn't, and that's the latter part of the chapters I mentioned earlier, balance. There's no balance there. You don't always want to be in the house of mourning and just be, so down and contemplative and, all that, but there is benefit in that. By the same token, you don't want to be just, well, you know what, I'm not even going to think about that. I'll go to this funeral, but I'm not thinking about all that. I'm just going to, sometimes we'll joke and do anything we can to keep from sitting and seriously contemplating the mortality of mankind, and more particularly our own mortality. But he says it's better, and it's because funerals and grief cause us to be more reflective. They remind us again of our own mortality. Verses 3 through 6 point out the tendency not to listen and learn so much in times of laughter and good times. I mean, think about how many times when things are good, we're enjoying ourselves, we're often not learning. We're not as apt, at least, to learn. It's not to say you can't learn when you're having fun. And Brother Marshall Keeble used to say, Brinkley shared it with me numerous times, that he would often use humor, and he would sprinkle it throughout his sermon, but he used a lot of humor in the very opening of his sermons. If you ever listen to, there's just a few old recordings. It was so long ago, and most of them are not the greatest audio quality because of how old they are. But if you ever listen to one of those, a lot of times you'll hear a ton of humor at the beginning, and sometimes people, even thought Keeble's just trying to be some kind of entertainer or something like that. But he would often say, and again, Brinkley shared it with me, that if you can make people laugh, if you can get them to laugh, you can get them to listen. And if you can get them to listen, you can get them to learn. And he preached in a time when a lot of times people were not very eager to listen to a black man. Sometimes he used that humor to disarm a hostile audience. And sometimes you had people that were maybe not very apt to listen to a black man. Well, they're even less apt to listen to a black man who is preaching this message that goes against maybe what they've heard most of their lives growing up, what they strongly believe. And so he understood, if I can get them laughing, that puts them a little more at ease, and they tend to listen better than they otherwise would. And man, there's wisdom in that. But he always came back to that using the gospel to teach. That was a door opening mechanism, if you will. So Solomon says, don't be so dismissive toward grief, toward mourning. And are we not sometimes dismissive of grief? Man, I was reading this. I think this was in Brother Kirchville's notes from West Palm Church of Christ. And, he mentions that. We often want to just be very dismissive toward grief. We want to get past it. We want to get back to laughing. And where our days seem to be more good, fun, enjoyable days as opposed to the contemplation, the reflection that we have during grief. But is it not also true we need that time of reflection and contemplation? There's a benefit in that. And so I think if nothing else from this particular section, I've learned that it's not wise, it's not necessarily a good thing to be so quick to be dismissive of our grief. Sometimes we need to embrace that. God has given us that. Sometimes we need to embrace it and use it to cause us to think, to reflect, to contemplate about our own mortality and make sure we're preparing ourselves for that day. Because Brother Jimmy says, all of us, I like that, all of us has an expiration date. As Christians, we're supposed to live God's will first because we don't know when he's going to call us home. So that's the idea here. So, Psalm 90, verse 12. So teach us to number our days that we may apply our hearts unto wisdom. Well, numbering our days is that idea, not just being so off balance that it's always a party, it's always laughing and having a good time. Balancing that out, though, with thinking and numbering our days. This is the path to wisdom. Frequent reflection, frequent listening, frequent contemplation. Verses 4 and 5 point out the foolish carelessness of this life without the necessary reflection. In other words, this carelessness of life without that contemplation, that reflection, it's just foolishness. It's vanity. And so he says, watch out for that. Listen to life's reminders. The fool's mind, it's always on fun. It's always on partying. It's the mentality of, and maybe you've even heard this before. Maybe you've even said this before. Sometimes people might say something like, I've even heard this at such, like, hey, man, this is too heavy for me. We're just not going to think about that. Sometimes we need to think about the heavy stuff, don't we? But sometimes that's the foolish mentality. Well, it's just too heavy. Let's go party. Let's go have some fun. And then verse 6, as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of the fool. I'm told this is kind of a play on words in the Hebrew. It's that crackling of thorns and pot, same Hebrew word. But it's that idea of the crackling. The idea here being that the fool's laughter, it's like a sudden flame. Fast. It's like, we might describe it in our time as a gasoline fire. It's just a big explosion, fast, a lot of flash, maybe a lot of noise, but it's soon over. It's soon gone. And so he says, 7 through 9, patience is better. Patience is better. Again, Kirchville has this as verses 8 and 9. It seems to me 7 kind of goes with this section, so I sort of adjusted that a little bit. But in verse 7, verse 7 is kind of hard to determine exactly where it goes. It's just, it could go in either one, I suppose. But surely oppression maketh the wise man mad, and a gift destroyeth the heart. And the idea here being that wise people, they get upset when they see one person taking advantage of another. Or wise people also get upset when they see someone who is swayed by a bribe. And that's that idea. I was looking to see. Yeah, King James has gift, and I think New King James, went to the other chapter. Sorry, I forgot to scroll. Yeah, bribe in the New King James and also ESV. But that's the idea. Wise people get upset. They see somebody take advantage of another. They get upset if they see somebody taking a bribe, and they're rendering judgment or a decision based on a bribe. This destroys reason. It debases the heart, as the New King James words it. In other words, it undermines society. You got people that just take advantage of one another. How do you have a society with that going on? That undermines society. And so, again, that's part of the reason, a big part of the reason why Jesus tells Christians, you are salt, you are light. You need to be what's good in society. That helps preserve society. We sometimes pray for our country. We pray for continued freedom, continued ability to serve God without hindrance. But we need to make sure we're living the life of being salt and life, because that's a big part of how that happens. So watch out for that. It undermines society. Verses 8 and 9, he's going to say patience is better than pride. Better is the end of a thing than the beginning thereof. And the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. And that first part of verse 8 really kind of goes with the previous section, because better is the end of a thing, the end of a life, in other words, than the beginning thereof. If I die in the Lord, is that not true? And so better, the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not in my spirit to be angry, for anger resteth in the bosom of fools. He says patience here is better than pride. Don't be so quick to get angry, because anger resides in the lap of fools. And I put a note here in my notes for myself, for all of us. Solomon says this is a choice. That is, to be quickly provoked to wrath or not. It's a choice. And I say that because, do we not sometimes say or attribute our hasty anger to other folks? Maybe it's their dumb choices. Maybe it's their hurtful words or actions. And I know, if I'm being honest with myself, there have been plenty of times in my life when I got really upset and said to somebody, maybe even as I'm apologizing, I say something like, is that first bell? I say something like, hey, I'm sorry I got so upset, but now if you hadn't have done that, I wouldn't have been so upset. And if we're not careful, we can sort of apologize but also pass the buck at the same time. Solomon says it's a choice whether you're angry or not. And so it's not everybody else's fault. It's not, if they hadn't said that, if they hadn't have done that, if they hadn't have provoked me, the good news here is, and it is good news, I have power over my anger. I can learn to control it. It's not to say it's going to be easy, not to say it's going to be just a quick fix, but I do have power over that. Patience is wisdom and humility and slowing down with the anger and words and so on. Patience is not just contrasted with anger here, it's contrasted with pride. Hasty anger, not anger, period. Remember Paul says in Ephesians, 4? You can be angry and sin not. Jesus was angry at times. We talked just a few Sundays ago about Jesus overturning tables in the temple. He was upset. It's not anger, period, but this hasty, being quick, so quick to anger. He says that is selfish, that is foolish, and so he ties it with pride. I need to be careful about that. And then verse 10, that'll get us to a good stopping point. Say not thou, what is the cause that the former days were better than these? For thou dost not inquire wisely concerning this. The present is better, is what he's saying here. And not just infinitely better, but what he's saying is don't fool yourself into thinking that the past is better than the present. We talked about this, a couple weeks ago, the good old days mentality. Nostalgia can deceive us. We often remember the past in a totally positive light. And a lot of times we forget its problems, its difficulties. That's very easy to do. But yet think about how often maybe you've gone back to a place you remember so fondly, but you see it's not at all the way you remembered it. Maybe even sometimes talking about old times with somebody, and that might not be exactly how I remembered it. Maybe I'd blotted out, just blocked out some of the bad times in my mind. Nostalgia can deceive us like that. We sometimes even have a saying, you can't go back home or something like that. It's not to say you can never go back home, obviously. It's just saying you can't go back and be exactly the way it was when you left. But in our self-deception sometimes we remember it a certain way, and we think if I go back, it'll be just like that. We'll pick right up where we left off, but it won't, because you've changed, they've changed. Sometimes we just tend to edit out all the bad and remember only the positive things, and that's just not reality. It's not bad to remember. God gives us memory for a reason. Not bad to remember, but I put in my notes, just keep it real. Keep the proper perspective, noting these things and appreciating the moment right now. Don't lose sight of that. And so we can pick up verses 11 through 13 and get the rest of this section. We'll do that, I guess. I don't think we got time now. This section, he says, wisdom is better. And I'll just say this. God has subjected the creation to futility due to sin. Sin entered the world. The creation is subject to futility. And this is the essence of the curse of sin. This world holds only futility, emptiness, vanity. There's nothing we can do to change this. You can't make straight what is crooked. There are some things we can't do anything about. We talked about that at length last week. Some things we just can't change. And he's coming back to this thought. He's already stated it in chapter 1, verse 15. That which is crooked cannot be made straight. So don't waste your life. Spend this life working toward preparing for eternal life, because the best life comes from listening to God's wisdom about life and this world, and especially listening to God when it comes to eternity. So he says, the teacher here, Solomon says, I'm going to take you through the school of life. I'll tell you there's some things that are better. Death is better. Mourning is better. Again, it's not to say all the time, but it's finding that balance. We'll talk about that in the next section. Wisdom is better. Don't waste your life. Look to God for wisdom. Look to God for guidance. You can't go wrong. That's living the best life. That's living life with purpose and with meaning. Thank y'all so much, and Lord willing, we will pick up there. You know what? I think we'll just put a peg in this, and we're not going to study any more from Ecclesiastes for the rest of this year. There's